The year was 1858. The air was thick, humid, and tasting of fear. Chains echoed across dusty ground where men, women, and children stood trembling beneath the gaze of buyers. Daniel's wrists burned from iron shackles, yet nothing burned hotter than his heartbreak. In front of him, his wife, trembling, holding their children close, their last moments together before hands of greed tore them apart. He screamed, fought, begged, but his voice drowned in the roar of the auctioneer. His family vanished into wagons that turned the road crimson under the setting sun. Most would collapse into despair. But Daniel did something else, something every man said was impossible, something that made plantation owners whisper his name like a warning and made the enslaved speak it like a prayer. What he did, no one could explain, and no one dared to forget. Daniel stood in the center of the dusty square, his feet sinking into soil that felt more like a graveyard than ground, and the scent of sweat and iron filled his lungs. He tried to remember the warmth of his wife's hands, the soft weight of his son sleeping against his chest, the whispered laughter of his daughter when she braided grass into little crowns. Those memories felt like water slipping through fingers, disappearing as fast as the sun faded behind clouds. Around him rose the shouts of men who treated flesh like goods and life like property, voices of auctioneers booming over a crowd eager to examine muscles, teeth, and scars. His heart tightened as his family stood on the platform, trembling, holding each other, afraid to breathe too loudly. He saw the fear in his wife's eyes, the silent plea begging for a miracle. He wanted to rush forward, tear down every chain, rip the collars from their skin, and run until the earth itself swallowed them whole. But his limbs were heavy, bound by iron that had eaten into his skin like an infection. The overseer beside him leaned lazily on a whip, smiling as though this destruction of a family was a form of entertainment, a show built on agony. When the auctioneer lifted his cane, voices surged. A hand lifted for the first bid, followed by another. His wife clutched their youngest, pressing her lips against the child's forehead, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear but could feel inside his bones. His daughter, barely tall enough to stand above the wooden boards, shook like a leaf caught in a storm, looking to her father with wide eyes that begged him to save her. Daniel struggled against the chains, the metal cutting into him, drawing thin lines of blood. He whispered to himself, not in prayer, but in a desperate attempt to anchor his soul to something, anything, as the bidding grew louder. The numbers rolled like thunder, each one a nail sealing the coffin of his former life. He remembered nights when the candlelight flickered against their cabin walls, when his wife hummed lullabies soft enough to calm even the rage living inside his chest. He remembered the way she taught the children to dream, even when there was no sky left to dream under. All of that felt impossibly distant. When the final bid fell, the hammer struck wood like a gunshot, and the world around Daniel died in a single echo. Men moved swiftly, tearing his children from her arms first. His son screamed, kicking, reaching toward Daniel with fingers spread like a drowning boy searching for a rope. His daughter fought silently, her tears falling without sound, her throat too tight even for a cry. His wife fought hardest of all, dropping to her knees, grabbing at skirts, boots, soil, anything to stay close to them. Rough hands tore her away, dragging her across the platform, her nails leaving scratches in the wood as though she could carve a path back to her children. Daniel collapsed to his knees, unable to bear the sight, his body quivering like a beaten animal. He tried to speak, to beg, but no sound came. His voice had been stolen by the horror before him. As the wagons rolled forward, his children were tossed inside like sacks of grain. His wife looked back at him with a face that had forgotten how to hope. She mouthed words he could not decipher, but knew were meant to hold him together. He wanted to scream her name, but instead, only air left his lungs. His world was disappearing, turning smaller with each turn of the wagon wheels. Dust lifted into the air, blurring the distance, until all he could see were fading silhouettes. He felt something in him break, the part that believed in a future, the part that believed in mercy. The overseers laughed and walked away, the sale already forgotten to them, but Daniel was frozen in a silence so deep it sounded like the grave. Night fell, swallowing the sky while he remained shackled to a post, left like an abandoned tool. The cold settled on his skin and he shivered not from the air, but from emptiness that spread through his chest like poison. His body curled forward from exhaustion, but his mind refused to shut down. He replayed every second of the day, imprinting his wife's tears into memory as though afraid he would forget her face. He thought about the stories whispered on plantations, about men who went mad, who forgot their names after losing their families, men who broke under grief so heavy it snapped their minds like twigs. He wondered if he was one of them now. The moonlight spilled over him, silver and indifferent, and something inside Daniel shifted. It was not rage nor sorrow alone. It was something older, deeper, a voice that rose inside him like a flame that refused to die. He realized that no matter how far they dragged his family, no matter what chains tried to anchor him here, the world could not end while his heart still beat. He remembered his wife's last look, the look that begged him not to disappear into the hollow that pain offered. He remembered his children's hands reaching for him. He felt the iron on his wrists pulse like a heartbeat, and he imagined the blood beneath it turning hotter, thicker, a molten force that refused to surrender. He lifted his head toward the sky as if demanding an answer, refusing to bow. The night was silent, but his breath grew steady, deep, something awakening inside him that even he struggled to understand. Daniel remained bound long after the moon had passed overhead, long after the sounds of the plantation had quieted into the heavy hush of night. His body should have surrendered to the cold, but instead it felt as though something beneath his skin was burning, as though grief itself had been forged into a weapon. He replayed every detail of the moment they were taken from him, refusing to let the memory fade. The seams of that day were stitched into him, bit by bit, like scars carved in places too deep for any eyes to see. He thought of his son's outstretched hands, reaching through air that Daniel could not cross. He thought of his daughter, silent in her terror, fighting with her shaking limbs. He thought of his wife, dragged across wooden planks that still echoed in his ears. Each thought fed the fire inside him, making his chest rise and fall with a slow, controlled rhythm that was no longer survival, but something else entirely. The ground beneath him felt like a living thing. The dirt, packed by generations of footsteps, seemed to pulse faintly, as if carrying untold stories within it. Daniel pressed his fingertips into the soil, cold and grainy against his skin, and imagined it stretching across miles, imagined it touching the wheels of that wagon carrying his family into darkness. Perhaps, he thought, the earth itself was witness to every injustice, storing the weight of them, letting it grow heavy enough to crack open one day. He sat there, tethered like a beast, yet his mind wandered beyond fences and fields, following the invisible path they had taken. His breath grew slow, as if each inhalation drew fragments of their presence from the air, holding on to them so they could not drift away. He muttered their names under his breath, not to pray, but to confirm that they were still real, that they had not become ghosts in a single day. Hours passed, though time felt foreign, shifting strangely around him. The plantation, once a cage made of wood and iron, began to feel small to him, as though the horizon had widened inside his mind. He began to understand what he must become. He had heard stories whispered in the slave quarters, stories of men who had escaped by turning themselves into shadows, stories of women who vanished into rivers and rose again in places no one could explain. Tales passed in the night, spoken with trembling voices, because even hope could be dangerous. Daniel had never believed them, not truly. But tonight, everything unreal felt possible, because what was real had already been destroyed. His world had broken, so maybe reality itself could break too. His muscles were stiff when he finally pulled against the chains again. This time it was not rage that drove him, it was purpose. Every fiber in him strained, but not wildly as before. It was measured, calculated. His breath synced with his movement like he was listening to some rhythm deep inside the earth. The shackles clung to him, metal biting into flesh, yet there was something shifting, something changing. His mind moved beyond the physical pain, as though he was peeling his existence away from his body, creating space between what he was forced to be and what he was about to become. He no longer felt like a man sitting alone in the night. He felt like a force gathering, waiting to be released. The sky began to lighten at the very edges with the pale suggestion of dawn. Daniel's eyes, heavy with exhaustion yet sharp with clarity, watched the horizon without blinking. Something inside him refused to let that sunrise pass while he remained here, powerless. The overseer would return soon, expecting to see a man broken, hollowed, defeated. The plantation master would expect to see nothing more than livestock accepting its fate. Daniel knew they believed he would bend, but he felt a pulse rising through him, not just heartbeat, something deeper, something ancient. He realized that the only way to survive what had happened, truly survive, was to become something they could not name, could not shackle, could not buy or sell. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the wooden post that held him. He listened, not with ears but with whatever part of a soul listens when a man is on the edge of losing everything. He listened for the footsteps of guards, for the sound of horses. But more than that, he listened for the echo of his wife's voice in his memory, for the final tremble of his daughter's fingers, for the empty cry of his son as he reached. The more he listened, the more he felt as if those memories were not fading but hardening, turning sharper, turning into a weapon he could wield. He felt his breath heat his face, the air around him shifting. He imagined his chains as threads rather than restraints. He imagined his bones as iron stronger than what bound him. He imagined his will reaching through miles like a phantom hand. The ground shivered beneath him. Or maybe it was his own body. He could not tell anymore. The weight of loss pressed against him, not to crush him, but to transform him. He knew that many men had died inside their minds, long before their bodies fell. And he knew that if he let himself collapse now, he would be one of them. He refused. He felt a silence inside him, heavy and still, like the moment before a storm decides where to break. He knew, with a certainty that bordered on madness, that something in him had crossed a threshold. He was no longer waiting for rescue. He was no longer begging unseen forces. He was preparing himself, piece by slow-burning piece, to walk into the impossible and drag reality behind him like a chain. The morning crawled in slowly, its pale light falling on Daniel like an unwelcome witness. He felt it on his skin before he opened his eyes, a soft warmth that seemed to taunt him with the promise of a day he did not ask for. The plantation stirred around him, hooves against soil, distant metal clanking, voices barking commands at tired bodies that had no choice but to obey. But Daniel was suspended in a different plane, one where time no longer moved the way it once did. He remained bound, but something inside him was already unshackled, pacing, waiting. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the dirt and turning the sky into a canvas that mocked his suffering with color. His eyes opened slowly, and when he looked at the world, it was not with the gaze of a broken man, but with the stare of someone whose soul no longer lived inside the limits of flesh. For a long time, Daniel remained still, letting the day unfold without acknowledging it. Movement belonged to those who accepted their fate. He was not among them anymore. He listened to conversations drifting across the yard, pieces of careless speech carried by wind. Someone complaining about the price of horses, someone laughing about the sale from yesterday, someone spitting tobacco juice into the soil that swallowed it without protest. None of them spoke of his wife or children. To them, the suffering of others vanished as quickly as coin changed hands. The absence of their names in the air struck him harder than any whip ever had. It was as if his family had never existed. That realization planted a seed of something fierce in him, something that took shape like a vow carved across the surface of his heart. Daniel closed his eyes and allowed himself to travel inward. He remembered stories whispered by moonlight, tales of enslaved men whose spirits refused to be contained. He remembered the elders speaking of forces older than blood, older than the soil itself, forces that answered only when a soul cracked wide open. His soul had cracked yesterday, completely. So now, in the silent cavern of his mind, something answered. It was not a voice, not something he could hear or understand. It was a sensation, like cold fingers tracing the inside of his ribs, like a breath that was not his filling his lungs. He felt the world expand around him, stretching in invisible directions. He felt the distance between him and the wagon shrink in a way that defied the logic of land and road. He imagined the wheels cutting through dirt, the horses pulling his family farther and farther away. And though logic said they were gone, his heart insisted he could almost feel them. as if grief itself had built a bridge between worlds. His muscles twitched, not from exhaustion, but from awakening. His fingers flexed against the chains, slow at first, then more certain, as though they were learning the memory of movement again. The metal cut deeper, tearing skin, but he did not stop. Pain was irrelevant now, an old language he no longer needed to understand. He pulled, not wildly, but with purpose. The wooden post creaked, his shoulders trembled, his breath slowed, and he felt something crack beneath him, whether wood or bone or reality itself, he did not know. The wind shifted, carrying with it faint sounds that were not from this place. Children's voices echoing, his wife's whisper drifting like smoke. It was impossible, yet his body reacted before his mind could question it. His pulse thudded in sync with their imagined footsteps, their calls, their breathing. The distance between them and him dissolved into something fragile, something malleable. He remembered how the overseer once boasted that chains could break any man. Daniel now believed the opposite. Chains could shape a man into something that no free mind could survive becoming. He tugged again, harder, and this time the ground itself seemed to shift, a tremor so subtle no one else noticed. Sweat rolled down his arms, mixing with the blood at his wrists, dripping into the dirt below. The earth drank it eagerly, like it had been waiting. Daniel inhaled deeply, the breath dragging through him like a current, gathering every shard of pain and sorrow and fusing them into a single force. He no longer felt like only himself. He felt like a vessel through which something ancient was rising. The guards did not see him yet. They were busy, distracted, complacent. They believed suffering made a man predictable. They believed grief crippled. They believed that what happened yesterday had already hollowed him out. They did not see the slow tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared, the way his heartbeat steadied into a rhythm that echoed like a drum calling spirits from the soil. His eyes opened, and for a moment, the world around him looked unfamiliar. Edges too sharp, shadows too alive. The plantation seemed like a painting, and he felt like a hand preparing to tear through the canvas and step beyond it. Then came the sound that changed the air. A faint snap. The chain, rusted from years of sweat and rain, gave way by the smallest fraction. It was barely noticeable, a whisper of metal surrendering. But to Daniel, it was thunder. It was a signal. He did not rip away from the post immediately. Instead, he sat in the stillness that followed, letting the shift settle inside him. His breath steadied, slowed to the pace of someone who had glimpsed the impossible and decided it was not a miracle, but a choice. He leaned his head back, feeling the sky above him, endless and silent, waiting for him to move. He could no longer feel the weight of despair crushing him. He felt something else, something sharp, something alive, something that promised that what he would do next would not only defy the men who owned his body, but defy the very world that allowed such cruelty to exist. The plantation carried on as though nothing extraordinary was beginning beneath its surface. Field hands shuffled past with blank eyes, their bodies moving on instinct alone, their minds locked away somewhere safer. Overseers barked, horses snorted, tools clanged, and yet none of them noticed the way the air seemed to tighten around Daniel, as if reality itself were holding its breath. He sat motionless for a long time, the broken link in his chain glinting faintly in the early light, hidden by dust and shadow. His wrists throbbed, blood seeping slowly, but even that seemed distant to him now. The pain was like a memory rather than a sensation. His body remained in this place, but part of him had already gone beyond fences, past roads, past the reach of hands that had torn apart his world. He lifted his head slowly, turning his gaze toward the horizon, toward the direction the wagons had disappeared. He stared as if he could see past the hills, past rivers, through towns and forests, straight to wherever his wife and children were now. His eyes did not blink. His breath did not falter. It felt as though a thread had connected him to them, invisible but unbreakable, tied somewhere under his ribs and pulled taut. The force of it almost hurt, but he welcomed the pain because it was proof that they were still alive, still reachable, still calling to him in some way only he could hear. He felt the wind shift, cool air brushing against his face, and in it he thought he could smell lavender, the faint scent his wife used to tuck behind her ear when she wanted to pretend she was free. That scent should not have been here, on this dirt, under this sun, surrounded by misery, yet he smelled it as clearly as breath. He leaned forward and pressed both palms to the ground, feeling the grit and dampness beneath his fingers. He imagined the earth stretching beneath roads and wagon tracks, imagined it carrying whispers and vibrations the way water carries waves. He wondered if the soil remembered every foot that had struck it, every tear that had fallen into it. He wondered if, by touching it, he could touch them. His pulse pounded through his palms, and he imagined that pulse traveling through the ground like a signal, like a calling. The world around him blurred for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in focus, as though everything unnecessary faded from his vision. He could hear the shifting heartbeat of the plantation, its cruelty, its order, its routine. And beneath that, faint and almost hidden, he thought he heard the distant echo of children crying, and a woman whispering a prayer into the dark. His fingers curled into the soil. Then slowly, he began to pull his arms apart. The remaining links of the chain tightened, groaned, resisted. He did not yank violently. Instead, he pulled as if he were coaxing reality itself to bend. His breath matched the movement. Inhale as the chain strained, exhale as the metal whined. His shoulders trembled with quiet fury, sinew tightening, veins rising like cords beneath his skin. He could feel something shifting inside him, not muscle, not bone, something deeper, something that felt as if his grief had been condensed into a single weight, and that weight was now pushing outward, demanding room, demanding air, demanding action. He felt the chain dig deeper into his flesh, the sting of tearing skin, but he continued, steady as a tide carving into stone. Another snap, louder this time. Metal surrendered to will. One hand came free, raw and slick with blood. For a moment Daniel simply stared at it, as though seeing his fingers for the first time. They trembled, but not from weakness. They trembled with the energy of everything he had held inside for too long. He placed that freed hand against the wooden post, pressing his palm flat against the rough grain. He remembered how his wife once leaned against a tree outside their quarters, holding their son on her hip, her voice soft with laughter. Wood had always been kinder than steel. Now, even this post seemed to soften beneath his palm, as though recognizing what he had lost, as though mourning with him. He tightened his grip, and with a slow, controlled motion, he pushed himself upright. His knees screamed under the weight of hours spent kneeling in dirt. But he ignored it. He rose as though he were lifting the earth itself with him. Standing felt unfamiliar, like relearning how to exist. The world looked different from this height. The plantation that once towered over him now seemed small, fragile, temporary. He felt larger than the fences, larger than the men who believed they owned him, larger than the sky that tried to contain the morning. His other wrist remained bound, chain dragging along the ground, but he did not rush to free it. Instead, he turned his face toward the direction his family had been taken, and he let stillness settle around him again. Stillness, he realized, could be power. In that quiet, he listened. His heartbeat slowed to a near silence. His breathing became measured. The wind brushed against him like fingers. He imagined reaching inside himself, into the hollow where his joy had once lived, and finding instead a new kind of strength, a strength carved from loss, from rage that did not burn wildly but smoldered, hot enough to melt what stood in its way. He imagined that strength filling every part of him, stretching into the arm still bound, into his legs, into the chain that clung to him like a final memory of captivity. His gaze narrowed, and it felt like the world could feel him looking, could sense him preparing. Then he took a single step. The chain dragged behind him, whispering across the dirt, leaving a thin scar in the ground as he moved. The sound of it was soft, but it was enough to make a horse at the edge of the yard lift its head sharply, ears twitching, enough to make a field hand glance over his shoulder with widened eyes, as though he had just seen something he would never speak aloud, enough to make the overseer on the far end of the yard pause mid-laugh, suddenly chilled for reasons he could not name. Daniel walked, slow, deliberate, every movement a declaration against the world that had tried to keep him kneeling. The sky above him brightened, but he did not look up. His eyes were fixed forward, locked on a destination that defied distance, defied logic, defied the rules men believed they had power to enforce. He walked toward a path only he could see, a path built out of grief, love, rage, and something deeper, something impossible. Daniel moved with the pace of a man who felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Each step he took was heavy, but not with fatigue. Heavy with purpose, as though every inch of ground he crossed was part of a vow carved into the earth itself. The morning continued unfolding around him, shadows shrinking as the sun stretched across the plantation, but he walked through it as though untouched by the day. His chain clattered softly against the dirt, a metallic whisper that seemed to announce his movement to forces seen and unseen. Somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the trees that bordered the plantation like silent guards, the road stretched out into a world he had never been permitted to know. He had only ever walked as far as he was allowed. But today, there was no allowance, only inevitability. When the first overseer finally noticed him, it was not with authority, but with confusion. The man blinked, rubbed his eyes as though what he saw must be a trick of sleep. Daniel, who had been chained, shattered, discarded only hours ago, was now standing, walking, eyes fixed on some distant point the overseer could not see. The overseer opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came. Something in Daniel's expression froze him, a quiet that was far more terrifying than rage. Daniel didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. He walked past him with the indifference of a force that could no longer be stopped. Other men turned, their attention drawn like moths toward a flame they could not understand. Some stared in horror, some in disbelief. One man dropped a bucket from his hands, water spilling across soil that immediately drank it. No one stepped into Daniel's path. They didn't know why. They simply couldn't. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that suggested that touching him would be like touching the edge of a storm. It felt as if the air around him had weight, as if it moved with him, as if the wind itself was escorting him. He reached the end of the yard and paused before the low fence, the last barrier between captivity and the unknown. His breath flowed slowly in and out, and he placed his hand lightly on the wood. It was old, splintered, worn by years of sun and rain and hands that had clung to it while dreaming of escape. For a heartbeat, the world went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Daniel pressed his palm into the fence and did not push. He simply leaned into it, and the wood split beneath his hand like it had been waiting all its life to break for him. It cracked open, soundless, falling apart in pieces that barely made a sound as they hit the ground. The path beyond was suddenly exposed, open, unguarded. He stepped through. Past the fence, the world felt wider, almost unreal. The trees loomed like watchful giants, branches swaying gently, as if bowing. The ground was softer beneath his feet, as though nature itself welcomed him where man had rejected him. He walked into the shade of the forest, and for the first time in hours, he inhaled without pain. The air tasted different here, cleaner, alive. He felt the thread inside him pull, tugging him forward, as if his very soul were being drawn toward the place where his family might be. The distance no longer mattered. He believed he could cross rivers, mountains, cities, not with his feet, but with his will. The deeper he walked, the less he felt bound by his body. His senses sharpened. He could hear his own heartbeat, but layered over it were sounds that did not belong to this place. The soft whimper of a child, the tired breathing of a woman trying not to break. He heard those sounds not with his ears, but with something raw inside him, something that refused to accept distance, time, or fate. His chain dragged behind him, marking his path like a story being written into the soil. The marks it left were long and jagged, as though he were tearing the world apart seam by seam. His thoughts carried him to memories he had once pushed aside. Nights when he had held his son and wondered whether the world would ever allow him to grow old. Afternoons when his daughter braided tiny flowers into her mother's hair, pretending that petals could erase scars. Moments when his wife held his face in both hands and whispered that one day things might change, even if they never lived to see it. Those memories no longer felt like moments of a past life. They felt like commands, like promises carved into him that demanded to be honored. Daniel's steps grew faster, though his breath remained calm. His chain grew lighter behind him as though the metal were giving up its grip. The forest grew darker, not with shadow but with a strange, heavy quiet. The silence felt full, as if the world itself was listening. He placed his hand on a tree trunk as he passed, and it shuddered faintly under his touch. leaves falling from its branches like tears. It felt as if everything he touched changed, as though his grief were a force capable of reshaping matter. A faint sound broke the air, the distant rumble of wheels on dirt, the creak of wood, horses snorting. His pulse quickened, but he did not run. Running belonged to fear, and fear had no place left in him. He continued forward, the forest opening before him in narrow corridors of light. Each step brought him closer to the sound, closer to the impossible notion that he could reach them. His mind no longer questioned how. His heart had already decided. Somewhere on that road ahead, a wagon rolled with the weight of stolen lives. Somewhere, a woman sat with her hands bound, tears drying on her cheeks. Somewhere, two children clung to each other, whispering their father's name like a spell. Daniel walked as if each breath brought him close enough to touch them. The world bent around him, and with every step, the impossible seemed less like a miracle and more like destiny.